Auctioned for $2 because of her size. What kind of pain does a woman carry when her worth is mocked in front of the whole town, when her very body becomes a cruel joke? How does she survive half a lifetime of whispers of being called too big, too plain, too unwanted? And most of all, what happens when one quiet cowboy places two silver coins on the table, takes her hand without seeing her face, and dares to say she is worth more than gold? The air in Dry Lantern that afternoon was thick with dust and whiskey breath. The saloon doors creaked open and shut with each gust scattering poker smoke into the street. It was a Friday, the kind of day when cowhands, drifters, and ranchers drifted in to laugh too loud and forget too much. In the center of it all stood Clara, 50 years old, her frame broad, her shoulders strong from decades bent over wood stoves, her dress plain cotton with frayed seams strained at the waist. In her apron pocket she kept a small clay jar, the sourdough starter she had carried through every season of her wandering. It was all she owned that never betrayed her. $2, barked Bauer the saloon keeper, his grin sharp as a broken bottle. $2 for the woman's debt. She can scrub your pots, cook your stews, keep your table warm. That's less than the cost of a barrel of beer. Laughter erupted, cruel and careless. Men slapped their knees. One called out, $2 for all that size. That's a bargain, she'll feed an army. Another chimed in, more cushion for the pushin'. The room roared. Clara kept her chin lifted. She had learned long ago that silence could be a shield even when it burned inside. Her fingers curled around the jar in her pocket as if its quiet fermentation could steady her heart. She remembered the first time her body had been mocked back when she was 17, forced to marry a man twice her age. He'd called her too much woman for his taste, though he'd still claimed her labor and her dowry. Years later, abandoned and alone, the words remained, cutting deeper than the desert wind. Who'll take her debt? Bauer pressed his eyes glinting. $2 is all it takes. She'll be yours till it's paid. The crowd shifted. Boots scraped. But no one looked at Clara, not really. They looked at her size, her silence, her shame. Then from the back of the room a voice. Steady, low, I'll pay it. Heads turned. A man stood near the door, hat brim pulled low. He didn't swagger, didn't smirk. He placed $2 silver on the bar with the care of someone setting down something sacred. And without glancing at Clara's face, without even waiting for her eyes, he turned and walked out into the dust. The saloon buzzed with disbelief. He didn't even look at her, someone muttered. Bought her like a sack of flour. Another laughed nervously, but the jeers had lost their edge. The cruelty had been interrupted. Clara stood frozen. Shame prickled her skin, but somewhere beneath it stirred something stranger, confusion, even a flicker of curiosity. Who was he? Why would a man buy freedom for a woman he refused to see? Her silence that night was heavier than ever, but in that silence a question began to form. Who was the stranger who paid $2 without meeting her eyes, and what did it mean for a woman who had spent a lifetime priced and mocked? The next morning in Dry Lantern was clear and sharp, the kind of light that stripped the town bare of its shadows. Clara rose before dawn as always, hands working by habit, flour water, the sourdough starter she had fed faithfully for years. By sunrise she carried a basket of loaves to the church, a quiet offering for the poor. The townsfolk accepted her bread without thanks, some without even looking at her. That was nothing new. She placed the basket on the steps and turned to leave only to find a man standing a few feet away. He held out a handkerchief. You left this behind, he said. Clara blinked. The cloth was hers dropped the night before in the saloon. But it wasn't the handkerchief that made her breath catch, it was the voice. She had heard it only once, steady as iron, bidding $2 for her dignity. You, she whispered. The man nodded. He was taller than she had realized in the smoky room, shoulders broad beneath a worn coat. His face carried lines etched by sun and sorrow, and his hair streaked with gray curled beneath the brim of his hat. He met her eyes with a gentleness that startled her. I'm Thomas, he said simply. I settled your debt. Clara searched his face. Why? Her voice was barely a thread. He looked down at the ground for a long moment before answering. Because it wasn't yours to carry. The words sank into her like water into dry earth. She wanted to argue, to insist that debt, shame, and ridicule had been her companions for so long, they might as well be her birthright. but the way Thomas said it, calm without pity, made her throat tighten. He shifted, clearing his throat. "You don't remember me, do you?" She frowned. "Should I?" "A flood," he said. 10 years ago. The river rose and half the town was starving. You came with a kettle of stew and bread. I'd lost my wife that winter. Didn't have the strength to cook. That meal was the first time I'd eaten without bitterness in months. Clara's brow furrowed. She recalled vaguely faces blurred by steam and hunger, her own trembling arms ladling soup to strangers. She had never thought anyone remembered. "I thought you deserved better than to be mocked like cattle." Thomas said, his voice steady but low. "That's all." She gripped her basket tighter, the warmth of the bread seeping into her hands. No one had ever spoken of her kindness before. They had spoken only of her body, her size, her silence. And here was a man remembering something she had done, not as a spectacle, but as a grace. Clara wanted to believe him, but belief was dangerous. It had broken her heart too many times. She lowered her eyes. "I didn't ask you to pay." "I know," Thomas said. "But I also know no one should be left standing there like that. Not you." Silence stretched between them, softer than the silence she was used to. She realized she was holding her breath. If his kindness came without condition, could she dare to trust it? Or would hope only open the door to more hurt? By the week's end, the whispers had taken on a life of their own. Dry Lantern was small enough that gossip moved faster than the prairie wind curling into every doorway and alley. Wherever Clara walked, she could hear it trailing her like a shadow. $2, someone muttered at the mercantile as she passed. That's all it took. "She's the $2 woman," another snickered by the water pump. The words were sharp, but it wasn't just their cruelty that cut. It was how familiar they felt. For half her life, she had been weighed, measured, and declared too much, too big, too plain, too old. And now reduced to a number she feared she might never escape it. She tried to keep her head high the way she had at the saloon, but inside her heart folded like damp linen. She spent her evenings in the back room of the inn, baking bread by lantern light. Kneading dough was the only rhythm that could quiet the storm inside her. Then one afternoon a knock sounded on the door. When she opened it, Thomas stood there holding a small burlap sack. "Potatoes," he said. "The ground out by my fence still grows 'em. Thought you might make use." Clara hesitated. "Why bring them to me?" He shrugged lightly. "Because seed only means something in the right hands. And you make things grow." Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken of her that way, not as too much, but as enough. Still, doubt rose sharp. Was this kindness or pity, gratitude for an old bowl of stew, or something more? She wanted to ask, but the words tangled in her chest. So she only nodded, clutching the sack like it was fragile. That night, as she roasted the potatoes over a low flame, the voices outside her door still echoed, $2 woman, $2 woman." But another voice, quieter, lingered too. The voice of a man who had said she made things grow. She didn't know which to believe. If doubt was louder than hope, could she ever see herself as more than a price? Or would Thomas's steady presence begin to tip the balance? The spring storm came sudden, rolling in from the western ridge like a herd of black cattle. By dusk, the streets of Dry Lantern were empty shutters, rattling rain slicing across the wooden boards of porches. Clara was caught in it, clutching her basket of loaves under her shawl. She hurried to the church steps, hoping to wait the storm out, when a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Thomas, his coat soaked, his hat dripping. Without a word, he took off the heavy oilskin draped across his shoulders and settled it around hers. "You'll catch your death walking in this," he said, his voice low but steady. Clara stiffened, unused to someone fussing over her. "I've weathered worse," she murmured. "I don't doubt it," he replied. "But you don't have to, not alone." They stood together under the narrow church eave, the rain clattering against the roof. For a long moment, neither spoke. Clara's hands fidgeted at her bonnet strings, the old habit she used whenever the world's eyes felt too heavy. That bonnet had been her shield for years, hiding the uneven hair and scars left when her family, in their cruelty, had shaved her head to teach her shame. The storm's wind tugged at the fabric. Her fingers hesitated. Then with a sudden breath, she untied the strings and let the bonnet slip into her hands. For the first time in years, she stood uncovered before someone else. The rain-muted light revealed the truth: thinning hair, uneven tufts, pale ridges of old scars. Her cheeks flushed, ready for recoil, for pity, for laughter. But Thomas didn't look away. His eyes softened, not with surprise, but with recognition, as though he had been waiting for this moment, this unveiling. Slowly, reverently, he reached out. With a hand roughened by fence work, yet gentle as a prayer, he touched the crown of her head. Then he bent, pressing a tender kiss where the scars lay. "They called this shame," he whispered, his breath warm against her. "But I call it proof of your courage to keep living." Clara's eyes stung, though no rain had touched her face. The weight of years, the ridicule, and the silence, the self-hiding, lifted just a little. Enough for her to breathe. For the first time, she believed he saw not what was missing, not what was mocked, but what endured. Could one gentle kiss on old scars rewrite the meaning of her past, or would the world's cruelty return to test her newfound courage? The storm had passed, but Clara carried its cleansing with her. The next afternoon, she walked into Bauer's saloon basket in one-arm bonnet left behind. The room stilled at her entrance. Men who had laughed before glanced up from their cards, waiting for the spectacle to continue. Bauer smirked from behind the counter. "Well, if it isn't the $2 woman, come to settle in and scrub some pots, Clara. That's what the papers say you owe." He slid a folded slip of paper across the bar, thick with inked signatures and jeers. But Clara did not flinch. She set her basket on the counter, and from her apron pocket placed a small slip of parchment, the receipt with Thomas's careful handwriting, proof of the payment he had made. "The debt was settled," she said, her voice firm but not raised. "Not by owning me, by ending the mockery." The saloon grew quiet. Chairs scraped as men shifted uneasily. "Don't matter," Bauer sneered. "A woman like you don't walk away so easy." Clara's hands moved to the basket. She pulled out a warm loaf, placed it on the counter with deliberate care. Two hands as if setting down something sacred. The smell of bread filled the smoky air. "I am not for sale," she said, "but I am for sharing." And with that, she tore the loaf in half, offering pieces to those who dared meet her gaze. One by one, the men accepted. The mocking hush gave way to an awkward silence, then to the soft sound of chewing. No one laughed. The door opened. Thomas stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He didn't need to speak. He simply walked to her side and stood there tall and steady, the quiet proof of his choice. His presence was enough. For the first time in years, Clara felt herself standing in the open, not as a joke, not as a shadow, but as a woman unshaken. Would this act of defiance be enough to silence the jeers for good, or would the town test her resolve even further? The silence in Bauer's saloon did not last long. By the following week, gossip had sharpened its teeth again, slithering through the streets of Dry Lantern. "They say she thinks she's somebody now," whispered a woman at the pump. $2 and suddenly she's the town's saint," muttered a ranch hand. "She'll bring shame to any man foolish enough to stand beside her," another laughed. The words trailed Clara everywhere. At the market, mothers pulled their children aside. At church, the pew beside hers stayed empty. Though she held her chin high, the weight pressed on her shoulders like wet wool. One morning, carrying her basket of loaves to the square, she felt the sting more sharply than usual. A group of young cowhands blocked her path, their grins cruel. $2 one drawled. "That's all it took, huh? Wonder what she'd fetch at auction now." Laughter cracked like a whip. Before Clara could step aside, a shadow fell across her. Thomas stood there tall and unyielding, his eyes steady as flint. Without a word, he reached for Clara's hand. His grip was warm, sure a tether in the storm. Then deliberately, he laced his fingers with hers and faced the boys. "This woman," he said, voice low but clear, "is worth more than all your wages put together. And she is mine not because of debt, but because I chose her." The cowhands shifted their laughter, withering under his gaze. One muttered, "Crazy old fool," before they scattered. The square grew quiet. Clara's cheeks burned, not from shame, but from the shock of standing openly, her hand clasped in his for all to see. The warmth spread through her chest, fighting the cold of long years. "Why did you do that?" she whispered, once the crowd dispersed. Thomas looked at her steady and unashamed. "Because I won't have you walking alone with their lies snapping at your heels. If there's a price to pay, let me pay it beside you." For a moment, Clara could not speak. All her life she had carried burdens alone, her silence, her only defense. Now for the first time she felt the weight being shared. Would Clara dare believe in a love that stood beside her so boldly, or would fear of being mocked again drive her back into hiding? The weeks that followed carried the hush of a prairie spring, soft rains, tender shoots, pushing through soil, and in Clara's heart, a stirring that felt almost like peace. Still, she moved carefully, half expecting the laughter to return, the jeers to undo what fragile courage she had built. But Thomas did not falter. Each morning he brought small offerings, a bundle of firewood, a jar of honey, a bouquet of wild prairie roses, clumsy in his large hands. He never spoke grand declarations. His love was steady as fence posts, wordless as the horizon, and just as vast. One Sunday, as the town filed out of church, whispers rippled again. Clara stood near the steps bonnet, still absent, her scars catching the sun. For a moment she braced herself for ridicule. Instead, Thomas stepped forward. In full view of the town, he took her hand as he had in the square. But this time he did not stop there. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissed it gently, and said loud enough for all to hear, "This woman is my future, and I will walk with her as long as the Lord gives me breath." Gasps rippled, a few scoffed. But others, quiet wives, weary widows, even a few ranchers, nodded. They had seen her strength, her silence, her bread that had fed their children. The shame the town had tried to bind her with began to unravel. That evening, Clara and Thomas sat side by side on his porch, the prairie stretching golden before them. He poured her tea, his hand brushing hers. "You were never $2 to me," he said softly. "You were always priceless. I just needed you to see it too." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were not from pain. They were from release. For the first time in 50 years, she felt not bought, not mocked, not hidden, but chosen. And as the sun dipped low, she leaned her head against his shoulder, the silence between them no longer heavy, but holy. Could the woman once sold for $2 truly believe she had found a love worth more than gold? And what future might they build side by side beneath the wide western sky? In the end, what began as a cruel auction became something no one in Dry Lantern could have expected. Clara, once laughed at, once reduced to the price of 2 silver coins, discovered that her value had never been measured by weight, beauty, or cruel jokes. It was found in her steadfastness, her quiet strength, and the love she dared to keep alive inside herself. And Thomas, the man who stepped forward without even looking at her face, reminded us all that true love is not about appearances or mockery. It's about choosing someone for who they are, not who the world says they should be. Friends, perhaps you too have carried names, labels, or scars that others tried to place on you. Clara's story whispers a gentle truth. Your worth cannot be auctioned off, and it cannot be mocked away. It lives in your kindness, your courage, and your willingness to keep walking even when others laugh. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to None Wild West Saga so you won't miss the next tale of second chances and quiet strength. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to be truly seen. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Would you like to see what comes next for Clara and Thomas? Or do you hope to hear more stories of women who, like her, found love and dignity in unexpected places? Your words matter, and they help shape the stories we tell next.